Nicholas Britell, composer for the Underground Railroad. This is your first TV show with Barry Jenkins. How did he bring this one to you?
Well, we've now collaborated on 3 projects together. And I had first started talking to Barry about this quite a few years ago. And I read the book. And then we knew it was going to be this massive scope of a project. Really, the biggest thing that I think any of us have ever done. It might be the biggest thing I ever do it just in the type, sort of the nature of what we were trying to accomplish, I think, because we really approached it in a sense like a creation of many, many worlds as the story unfolds. And that's something that we can definitely talk more about. But to get back to the beginning of it, we started talking about it, I guess it was really middle of 2019 where we started really getting into it. And then as we do on all of our projects, we have the ability to really sort of think early on about it, even before Barry goes to shoot. So that's kind of how we first got into it.
One thing that struck me about this show was that, I think we all know like Barry's films are, visually stunning, but I feel like his sound design in his projects are underrated. And in this, I feel like in the dialogue-free scenes, you can really hear like the ambient sounds, like the buzzing of the cicadas or like the dirt on the ground, and that's like embedded in some of the scores because there's some like diegetic pieces. So, and then I thought I was like, oh, that kind of makes sense because they do go underground. But was this something you and Barry discussed?
Absolutely, and first of all, I couldn't agree more. The sound, the sound creation that went into this was massive in scope. And Annalie, who's our incredible sound supervisor, actually, she and I at times worked very closely because, as you've noted, from the very earliest stages of the project, sound was actually really integral to what we created. The first real kind of idea, I think, that Barry and I talked about was actually related to sound. He was in Savannah, and one day I was in New York at the time. This was pre-pandemic, and I remember getting an audio message, like a text audio message from Barry, and I listened to it, and it was just the sound. It sounded like drilling, or it sounded like construction equipment, and I honestly had no idea what that was really that he was sending me. And a couple hours later, he texted and he just said, "Did you get what I sent?" And immediately I knew what he was talking about, because I think one of the really wonderful things about forging these longer term creative partnerships is you really get a sense of the people you work with and the types of questions I think that you're going to ask each other. And immediately when he said that to me, I started experimenting with that sound itself, seeing what would happen if I bent it, what would happen. And what was interesting was when I sort of stretched it out, there was this kind of undulating motion to the tones, actually. It had this sort of interesting up and down to it, and it had a rhythm, and Barry was really into the rhythm, and it literally was construction equipment that was drilling into the ground just far away, not even on set. It was sort of, near the set. And that was the first conversation about this idea of exploring sound. And what did that mean? And what would it mean to explore elemental forces? So for example, the idea of digging, the idea of drilling into the ground, of going downward, of going underground. And that led us into sort of this idea of going downward and earth. And then we explored like air, what's in the air, the sound, the cicadas, the sound of the air. And I would do a lot of experiments with Barry with cicadas. And actually Annalie sent these incredible field recordings of cicadas. And then we got into fire and the idea of fire and the sound of fire. And so that from early on, there was this kind of idea of taking these literal sounds and weaving them into the score. And so that was both something which I think, it certainly wound up in the score, this sort of as a like almost a landscape, an element. But it also directly led to some of the very musical ideas. So for example, the idea of going downward and that feeling of digging, that led to this idea of exploring a kind of chromatic descent, this motif that I wrote, this sort of E flat, D, D flat, C, which you hear, which creates its own kind of rhythm throughout the series. And that ended up through a very long circuitous path, that actually ended up being one of the key elements of what you hear right at the very beginning of the series, that opening piece.
Oh yeah, yeah, because that's I can definitely hear it now. Just but how often does Barry send you audio with no context and lets you figure it out?
That's the first time. That was the first time. We,
Okay.
you know, I would definitely say, I mean, I cherish these early conversations that I have with Barry because it's one of the most, I think it's one of the most fascinating parts maybe of our process is the early moments when we both say to each other, we don't know where we're going to wind up. We don't know what the answers are. And the process, that journey of figuring it out, that's the whole thing. It's the learning as we go of this. But those early ideas, you know, on Beale Street, for example, Barry had this instinct of the sound of brass and horns. On Moonlight, we talked about the idea of, you know, utilizing an orchestral sound, but what if we applied this chopped and screwed technique to it? So there were each project, there are these early kind of ideas, which are very inspiring to start exploring. And yet it's a starting point. You know, there's so much that we learned over the course of this project. And up until, actually, I mean, Barry and I sort of talk about this. I think there's this interesting moment in every project where it's like 60% of the way through, maybe 60 to 70% of the way through, where you figured enough out that all of a sudden you reach this almost like critical mass of concepts. And immediately you then realize that you want to go back and reapproach everything you did at the beginning because you've now learned enough about what you're actually doing, you know? So, so that's just sort of, that's kind of the way we work.
Mm-hmm. Well, like you said, like each episode is kind of, it's standalone. It's like very episodic because Cora is traveling to different states and she goes through a lot, and it's like she's, you know, experiencing a lot of different things, and I feel like the music reflects that as well, and there's varying states of like danger and dread, and if like you said, like there are like different sonic landscapes for that, but then in some scenes or like episodes, like the Ridgeway episode, there's like barely any music, and I thought that him, because he's so like laser focused, like his focus is so narrow and like catching her, and he's narrow-minded as well. So was that something you and Barry also discussed?
These are all the big questions. You know, I think one of the amazing things about working with Barry, he has such amazing insight and feeling for every moment of, I feel, what is this huge scope. So for example, early on, I would even say to him what he was feeling for different episodes, and he knew which episodes were going to be very sparse and stark, and he knew which episodes he didn't want a lot of music. And I think it's always a very important element, especially on something as large scale as this, to think about that kind of architecture of where does the music go, and maybe even more importantly, where doesn't the music go, you know? And in particular, you brought up Ridgeway. One of the interesting things is there are so many musical worlds in this, but in particular, Ridgeway was something that took a long time for us to figure out. Actually, I view Ridgeway's musical palette as actually non-musical. We did not give him themes, you know, very purposely. He has sounds, he has tones. There's these sort of very bent and distorted brass notes that just almost sit on their own. They're these sort of terrible horn notes is the best way I could put it, really. But it was very conscious that Barry and I did not want to give him a musical theme. And there are many places where the music is much more overt and much more lush. And actually, every time we do something like that, especially with the larger scope music, it's always on purpose. And in particular, from the first time I read the book, actually, there were these concepts of the historical anachronisms, the magical realism. I remember reading about South Carolina in the South Carolina chapters, even in the book, and you know, there was a skyscraper in the mid 1800s, and I remember thinking to myself, I didn't know there were skyscrapers in the mid 1800s, and of course there were not in the 1800s. And that's the whole thing, where there's this feeling of, I think the key word is there's a sense of strangeness, and that was something that early on Barry and I talked about. How do you convey that sense of strangeness? Because I think there's a way of doing it where it's very overt, but Barry and I often don't go for maybe the first thought. You know, it's sort of like, what are all the ways we could do this? And interestingly, as an example of all these different kind of musical worlds and very contrasting Ridgeway, in South Carolina, there is this incredibly lush orchestral sound, which to us in that place felt very strange. It's very fantastical almost, you know? So I think there was this combination of always saying, what is the counterpoint? What is something that you could do? Because for example, if we just did like a sci-fi kind of sound, that wouldn't necessarily evoke that in the same way.
Well, how does working on a project like this, limited series and 10 very standalone episodes, compare to something like Succession, an ongoing series where you're, really scoring and showing the evolution of that story and those characters?
That's a great question. They're very different. They're very, very different in obviously so many ways. But I think on a composing level, the key difference is that when we go from episode 1 to episode 2 of a season of Succession, we are still with the Roy family, and we're still probably in New York or London or perhaps a yacht in the Mediterranean, but we're still in the same universe in some ways. And I think with Underground Railroad, the key thesis from early on was that every state is not just a different physical state, but it's a different state of mind. It's a different state of consciousness in a lot of ways. And so that required so many different musical ideas. And I think the balancing act there was, obviously we need to connect things through a thread. We need to figure out, points at which things do recur and points at which things make sense as far as evolution. But at the same time, it was important to really delineate these different worlds. So I think with Succession, it's important, actually the opposite is almost true. It's important that I'm evolving a set of themes which are really, these are our ideas, and we're almost linked with the characters in that way. They almost have become kind of their own characters, I think, in some sense, at times in Succession. But so it's a very different process, I would say, in how I approached both of them.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we are all very excited for Succession season 3, and congratulations on Underground Railroad. It was great speaking with you, Nick, and you get to stay on because everyone's coming back.